The blonde nurse's hands moved across the keyboard like she was defusing a bomb. Methodical. Precise. No wasted motion. Cedar Creek Medical's cardiac unit hummed around her, ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, monitors beeped in staggered patterns, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the constancy of cicadas at dusk. Hannah Clarke didn't look up from the medication chart she was logging. Didn't need to. She'd already counted the exits, assessed the fire suppression system placement, and identified which ceiling tiles concealed electrical conduits. 8 months into her nursing position, muscle memory from 2 deployments in Bagram still ran deeper than civilian muscle memory. Deeper than the blonde hair she'd grown out. Deeper than the softness she'd carefully constructed in her hands, the way she held a syringe like it might break instead of like it was a weapon. Her forearms showed no scars. That was intentional. The tattoo on her left shoulder blade, the one that said Prophet in her lieutenant's handwriting, inked into her skin after the Sanjin Valley operation, stayed hidden under scrubs and long sleeves. The pale tan line on her ring finger from 4 years of wearing military-issue titanium stayed visible. People noticed absence. Absence told stories. Absence was the best cover. She typed in a patient's lab values with 10 fingers that had once restarted a Marine's heart with CPR alone while dragging him through a firefight, and the system accepted her entries without question. That was the thing about working in a real hospital, they cared that you could chart correctly. They didn't care who you were before the scrubs. Hannah reached for her jacket on the back of her chair before heading to the next patient room. The fabric was unremarkable, standard issue from the hospital's employee store, navy blue, pockets reinforced because real nurses needed pockets. Her hand found the inner seam where she'd sewn the unit patch 8 months ago, the night before she'd gone undercover. She didn't look at it. Didn't need to. The faded cloth was still there, the emblem of her battalion worn almost transparent from 2 decades of salt sweat and desert dust. She touched it once, a tactile confirmation that the person underneath the blonde hair and the deferential posture still existed. Then she pulled her scrub jacket on over it and moved into the hallway. Captain Marcus Webb's room was 3 doors down. She knew this without checking the assignment board. She'd already reviewed his chart twice, post-operative day 2, emergency cardiac stent placement, vital stable, expected discharge in 48 hours if no complications. He was sleeping when she entered, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical assistance of the wall-mounted oxygen cannula. She didn't stare. She'd learned not to stare 8 months ago. Instead, she moved to the 4-pole, checked the drip rate on his heparin infusion, verified the line for signs of infiltration, and made a note in his chart. Her handwriting was too good for a nurse. Too military. Too practiced. She'd learned to intentionally make it slightly messier, slightly less perfect. The handwriting of someone who cared but wasn't obsessive. The handwriting of someone who wasn't analyzing every detail like she was gathering intelligence. But she couldn't help noticing his forearm. There, wrapped around his right arm just above the foresight, was a tattoo. She'd seen it in his file photo, but seeing it in person was different. The ink had faded over years, desert sun did that to permanent markings, but the letters were still readable if you knew what you were looking for. Prophet. Her call sign. The one she'd carried through 3 tours, through the operation in Sanjin where she'd called in airstrikes while bleeding into her combat vest, through the night in Bagram when everything had fallen apart and Marcus had been one of the 8 who'd survived. 8 soldiers out of a team of 42. He'd gotten her call sign tattooed on his forearm the day he was medically cleared to leave the hospital in Germany. She'd seen the photo once, in a classified briefing room she wasn't supposed to have access to, before she'd volunteered for the undercover assignment. He didn't recognize her. That was the entire point. Hannah Clarke, the nurse, had short blonde hair and soft hands and a voice that didn't carry authority. Prophet, the medic who'd run into burning buildings to drag people out, was someone he'd never see again. She adjusted his oxygen cannula, the movement automatic, professional, unremarkable, and stepped back from the bed. His eyes didn't open. His hand, the one without the 4, remained loose against the white hospital blanket. She was just a nurse to him. One of a dozen who'd come through his room in the past 36 hours. Forgettable. Efficient. The kind of person you didn't think about after she left. She closed the door quietly and moved back to the nurse's station. That's when she heard the voice from the physician's lounge. Not loud. Dr. Pierce didn't need to be loud to carry authority. He was on his phone, laughing about something, and the laugh sounded like a knife being sharpened. Her charting is too detailed. Like she's trying to document everything. Building some kind of case. A pause. No, I'll handle it. These nurses need to understand their limitations. Another pause, longer this time. You'll have the reallocation done by Friday? Perfect. Nobody stays when they can't get shifts. Hannah didn't react. She'd learned not to react 8 months ago. She simply logged out of the charting system, pulled up the next patient's medication record, and waited for her hands to stop shaking. Except they didn't shake. That was the thing about being trained as a ranger before you were trained as anything else, your hands learn not to shake in dangerous situations. Her hands understood, on a cellular level, that shaking got you killed. She continued typing. Her fingers were steady as surgical steel. The trembling, if it happened at all, would come later. In the parking lot. In her apartment. In the shower at 3 a.m. when she was alone and the cover could slip. Not here. Not where anyone could see. Dr. Pierce emerged from the lounge exactly 47 seconds later. She knew it was 47 seconds because she'd started counting at the phrase about charting being too detailed. He walked past the nurse's station with the posture of someone accustomed to occupying space, his white coat crisp and expensive, his shoes polished to a shine that took time or money to maintain. Probably money. He had the look of someone who'd never had to do anything himself. Mid-50s, probably, with the kind of face that had come from old money and newer Botox. His eyes found Hannah at the desk with the precision of a hunter. She felt him looking before she looked up. Miss Clarke. Not a question. Not a greeting. A statement of her presence, said the way someone might acknowledge a piece of furniture in their office. A moment. She logged out of the system. Closed the chart. Stood up with the kind of controlled deliberation that came from years of standing up in situations where standing up too fast got you shot. Of course, doctor. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed the moment just before explaining why another person had failed him. Your documentation is exemplary. I've noticed. Very thorough. He glanced at her over the top of his reading glasses, another affectation, she noted. He didn't need them. The glasses were for effect. For authority. For creating the impression of someone who scrutinized details. Perhaps a bit too thorough. I apologize if my charting doesn't meet the hospital standard, doctor. I can adjust my notation protocol. The smile widened slightly. He'd been waiting for her to apologize. What I'm concerned about, actually, is scope creep. Nurses sometimes develop ambitions. Start thinking they understand clinical decision-making the way physicians do. Starts with detailed charting. Ends with a lawsuit. He adjusted his glasses. The gesture was meant to look casual. It wasn't. We need to maintain clear professional boundaries. I'm sure you understand. Hannah understood. She understood that he'd been making phone calls about her. She understood that her documentation style, the byproduct of 8 months of gathering evidence about his billing code inflation scheme, was making him nervous. She understood that he was a man accustomed to authority and uncomfortable with anyone who might see past his carefully constructed professional image. She understood, from her handler's encrypted message 2 days ago, that she was close to something. Close enough that Pierce was starting to feel pressure. I understand perfectly, doctor. She met his eyes. Held them for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to be respectful, not long enough to be challenging. The practiced gaze of someone who was exactly what she appeared to be. A nurse in her place. Deferential. Harmless. Thoroughly forgettable. I'll be more mindful of my notations going forward. He nodded, satisfied. Turned back toward the patient wards. Called over his shoulder without looking at her. "See that you do. We have standards here at Cedar Creek Medical." She waited until he was out of earshot before she moved. Walked to the bathroom with the measured pace of someone on a normal shift break. Locked the door behind her. Checked the stall, the ceiling, the ventilation grates, habit, not paranoia, though in her line of work they amounted to the same thing. Only when she was absolutely certain she was alone did she pull out her phone. The device was encrypted 3 layers deeper than a Pentagon communications terminal. She thumbed open the messaging app and typed one word, Pierce. The response came back in under 90 seconds. Acknowledge. Continue mission. Web status? She typed, patient stable. Identity secure. Confirmed. Handler contact Thursday 0800 at usual location. Stay operational. Hannah deleted the messages automatically, the way the app had been designed to do. Pocketed the phone. Looked at herself in the mirror, blonde hair, soft features, tired eyes that had learned how to look harmless. The woman looking back at her wasn't Prophet. Prophet was a ghost. A memory. A name tattooed on a ranger's forearm that he was never supposed to meet again. Prophet was the person who'd survived the ambush in Sanjin because she'd made it her job to keep her people alive, and she'd been very good at her job until there were 4 more people alive and 13 fewer than there'd been that morning. Hannah Clarke was the nurse who charted too carefully. Who might expose a fraud ring that had been quietly inflating billing codes for phantom cardiac procedures while funneling the profits to connections with suspected ties to insurgent networks? Who'd been placed in Cedar Creek Medical to monitor a witness and gather intelligence and who, for the past 8 months, had been doing exactly that while staying invisible. She opened the bathroom door and walked back to the nurse's station. Captain Marcus Webb was still sleeping. Dr. Pierce was somewhere in the cardiac unit, probably reviewing charts with the same meticulous attention he'd previously displayed toward intimidating nurses. The monitor beside the station showed Webb's heart rate steady at 72 beats per minute. Strong. Regular. The heart rate of someone recovering well from surgery. Someone who'd survived what he was supposed to have died from, the same way he'd survived Sanjin, the same way she'd survived everything that came after. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Webb was just one piece of a larger operation. The investigators back at the Pentagon had flagged 17 similar cases at Cedar Creek in the past 18 months. 17 cardiac procedures that shouldn't have existed. 17 billing codes that had generated phantom revenue. And somewhere in that network was a connection to an organization that had names on a list she'd helped generate in Bagram. An organization that had people who wanted her dead. An organization that had already proven it would kill anyone who stood in its way. Hannah pulled up the next patient chart and started notating. Her handwriting stayed just imperfect enough. Her hand stayed just relaxed enough. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the blonde hair and the soft voice and the practiced deference, Prophet waited. Watched. Gathered intelligence in the way she'd been trained to gather intelligence, methodical, precise, with the patience of someone who understood that the most dangerous warriors were the ones nobody was watching. The intercom crackled overhead. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. Not her patient. Not her problem. She continued charting. The hospital moved around her like a tide, a nurses answering call lights, doctors moving between patient rooms, visitors in the waiting area that she'd identified and assessed out of pure operational habit. Cedar Creek Medical was her mission space. Dr. Pierce was her target. And Captain Marcus Webb, sleeping 3 doors down with her call sign tattooed on his arm, was the leverage she wasn't supposed to care about. She reached for her jacket once more. Felt the unit patch through the fabric. Touched it like other people touched prayer beads. Like a talisman. Like a reminder that the person in the mirror was just a disguise, and underneath, where it counted, she was still exactly who she'd always been. The shift bell was going to ring in 20 minutes. Another 8 hours of controlled movements and careful documentation and the practiced invisibility of someone who understood that the greatest power in any room was the power to go completely unnoticed. 8 more hours of waiting. Watching. Gathering the evidence that would take down Dr. Pierce and expose the network that extended far beyond Cedar Creek Medical, far beyond Denver, far into the spaces where money and violence and national security converged in ways that civilians like Dr. Pierce would never fully understand. Hannah Clarke returned to the nurse's station. Pulled up the next chart. Started typing. And profit, patient and precise, waited for Thursday morning. Thursday morning arrived with fluorescent light and the particular silence of a hospital before shift change. Hannah Clarke stood in patient room 340, reading the medication order on the monitor, heparin 5,000 units for push. She read it twice. Then a third time, her eyes tracking the decimal point with the same precision that once cleared rooms in Bagram. The number was wrong. Not by much. By exactly one decimal place that would deliver 50,000 units instead of 5,000, a dose that would turn Captain Marcus Webb's blood to water, cause massive internal hemorrhage, kill him in the time it took a family to hold hands. The elderly wife sat in the vinyl chair by the window, her husband's appendectomy chart open on her lap. Their adult son stood near the vitals monitor, watching the numbers like they might suddenly speak. Hannah moved without hesitation. She logged into the second medication cart, pulled the heparin vial, measured it into a syringe, 5,000 units, and documented the correction in real time. Then she went to find Dr. Pierce. He was reviewing charts at the nursing station, his tie silk and his expression carved from something harder. Hannah waited until his eyes lifted. Doctor, patient room 340. The heparin order has a decimal error. I've corrected it to 5,000 units per protocol. The original dose would have caused fatal coagulopathy. Pierce's hands went still on the keyboard. Something flickered across his face, not concern. Calculation. His voice, when it came, moved like a tank idling in a garage, low and gathering momentum. Nurse Clarke. Your job is to follow orders, not practice medicine without a license. This constant second-guessing makes you a liability, not an asset. He said it loud enough for the break room doors to open. Loud enough for 2 passing residents to slow their walk. Hannah stood with her arms at her sides, her shoulders level, her stare as flat and cold as winter steel. She watched his voice rise, watched the indignation redden his face, watched him point at her like she was a problem he could solve with volume. I don't pay you to think, he said. I pay you to execute. Your arrogance puts this hospital at legal risk. I'm documenting this as insubordination, effective immediately. When his voice cracked on the last word, when it bent under the weight of his own anger, Hannah spoke. Quietly. Each word a separate sentence. Your need to be right just killed your credibility. Then she turned and walked past the stunned family in room 340, past the wife's trembling hands, past the son's wide eyes, past the monitors that would have flatlined if she'd done what Dr. Pierce demanded. The son caught her arm at the doorway, his whisper urgent, "Thank you. Thank you." But he wouldn't meet her eyes when Pierce returned 15 minutes later, wouldn't say it loud enough for anyone else to hear, wouldn't stand beside her when the real cost began. The break room at lunch was a corridor of empty chairs when Hannah sat down with her lunch container. She'd made the sandwich at 0500 that morning, turkey, single slice of cheese, 2 pieces of wheat bread, measured mayonnaise. Soldier's lunch. Quiet fuel. She opened the container and sat at the table for 8. Within 90 seconds, the room had purged itself like a wound draining. Conversations died mid-syllable. Chairs scraped. The break room door wheezed shut on its pneumatic hinge, and Hannah sat alone at a table built for company. Her reflection in the microwave door showed no expression. She ate methodically, taking the same number of bites she'd learned in mess halls across Bagram, breathing between them, treating the sandwich like a task to complete rather than an experience to enjoy. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant frequency. Outside, Denver traffic whispered past on Spee Boulevard. Inside, Hannah Clarke ate lunch alone, and that silence had weight. By 1400 hours, Pierce had moved to his next calculated move. The public whiteboard outside the nurse's station, the one used for holiday schedules and birthday celebrations, now bore a written warning in crimson marker. The message was a blade disguised as policy, written warning: Hannah Clarke, insubordination, unauthorized clinical decisions, failure to respect chain of command. Red marker. Large print. Positioned at eye level where no one could miss it. Nurses walking past averted their eyes. Some slowed as if considering acknowledgement, then accelerated their pace. Maria Escobar, who'd trained Hannah on the medication systems, paused at the board. Hannah saw her jaw tighten, saw her hand move as if to speak, then watched her keep walking. The message was clear: distance was survival. Hannah read the notice once, her face carved from ice, processing the documentation like a soldier reading an after-action report. Then she returned to her medication cart and continued her work. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't rise. She moved through the afternoon the way she'd moved through hostile territory, present, alert, and showing nothing. That night, sitting in her Subaru in the Cedar Creek Medical parking lot, Hannah allowed herself 20 minutes of stillness. Her hands rested loose on the steering wheel. She breathed in counts of 4, the same breathing pattern she'd taught to the medic in her squad when mortar fire crept closer to their position. The technique had a name in the military: tactical breathing. Calm under pressure. Her eyes were closed, and she could see the whiteboard in red marker. She could see the break room empty. She could see the son's grateful eyes refusing to meet hers. In his office on the 3rd floor, Pierce made phone calls. His door was closed, but his voice traveled through the administrative corridor like something meant to be heard. Hannah learned about the calls through observation. Maria's shift change notice appeared on the schedule. Night rotation. 6 weeks minimum. Hannah noticed it the next morning when she pulled up the staff calendar at 05 for 5. His second move was subtler. Her access card, which previously opened the medication rooms on the 4th and 5th floors, now locked her out of the temperature-controlled pharmacy cabinet. The system notification was automatic, clinical, and absolute, user access restricted. Contact administrator for clearance. She found this while preparing morning medications, her hand holding a patient's chart and an empty syringe. She didn't ask for clarification. She didn't approach Pierce's office. She simply noted the restriction and documented it in her personal file, the one she kept hidden in the jacket pocket of her uniform, dates and times and small acts of sabotage arranged like evidence. The third move came through the schedule. Hannah's rotation shifted. Where she'd worked 0700 to 1900 on medical surgical floors, she now found herself assigned to geriatric care, 1500 to 2300, the unpopular shift that ended at night. The notice appeared the same way the others had: clinical, official, without room for negotiation. Dr. Pierce had simply rerouted her away from the floor where Captain Marcus Webb would arrive Thursday afternoon. Except Hannah had already confirmed the arrival time. His chart, uploaded to the Cedar Creek Medical system at 0832 that morning, noted a transfer from the VA Medical Center in Colorado Springs. Routine post-operative monitoring following an appendectomy. Patient condition, stable. Post-op expectations, 4 to 6 days. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds when she read it. Not longer. Not less. 3 seconds to absorb the complication, catalog it as a new variable, and adjust her operational parameters. Captain Marcus Webb was coming to Cedar Creek Medical. The man with her call sign tattooed on his forearm in block letters surrounded by grid coordinates was coming to the hospital where she was slowly being erased. Thursday afternoon arrived at 1,347 hours. Hannah was in the geriatric wing, distributing afternoon medications to Mrs. Chen in room 547, when the overhead system crackled: transfer incoming. Cardiac care, Bedford to 12. ETA 5 minutes. She continued her work. Continued the systematic distribution of medications, continued the documentation, continued moving like a nurse and not like a woman watching the man she dragged through enemy fire arrive at a hospital where she was a liability, where her name appeared in red marker on a public whiteboard, where her access was being systematically restricted. But she knew the stairwell schedule. She knew which corridors had fewer foot traffic between 1345 and 1400. She moved with practiced efficiency to the 4th floor, arriving at the nurse's station just as the gurney turned the corner into the cardiac wing. And there he was. Captain Marcus Webb lay on a stretcher with post-operative pallor and a chart that read routine appendectomy recovery. His arm rested across his chest, and visible beneath the hospital gown was the tattoo, Prophet in block letters, the coordinates surrounding it like a prayer, the mark he'd gotten in the field hospital at Bagram in the hours after they'd carried 3 wounded through a killbox while mortars rewrote the earth around them. Hannah watched from the medication station as orderlies positioned his bed, as nurses began their intake vitals, as the machinery of hospital routine absorbed him into its protocols. Webb's eyes were sedated, unfocused, watching the ceiling with the distant gaze of morphine. He looked directly at Hannah twice during the transfer, once as they moved past the nurse's station, once as they positioned him in the bed. Both times, something flickered in his eyes, a moment of almost recognition. But he saw a blonde nurse in civilian softness, not the blood-splattered medic who'd stitched him together in a field tent while rounds impacted the sandbags outside. He saw a stranger. Hannah catalogued this as mission parameters achieved. Webb didn't know who she was. The undercover placement remained intact. But she'd seen his vitals on the intake sheet, heart rate slightly elevated, core temperature 99.4 degrees Fahrenheit, slight oozing from the lower abdomen where the surgical site was beginning to show stress. Early warning signs. The kind of subtle indicators that separated routine recovery from post-operative complications. From across the nurse's station, she watched the charge nurse assign his care to Nurse Patterson, who was 3 months out of nursing school and still moved like someone terrified of breaking the equipment. Hannah's jaw tightened, a single muscle flexion that would have gone unnoticed by anyone not trained to see it. Dr. Pierce emerged from the stairwell at 1,410 hours, his expression already calculated. He moved directly to Hannah at the medication cart. His smile was a weapon he'd learned to sharpen over years of institutional power. Nurse Clarke. Captain Webb's care is being transferred to Nurse Patterson effective immediately. You're being moved to the geriatric wing for the duration of his stay. I need someone with your particular talents caring for the elderly patients. Isn't that right? Hannah's hands continued their work. Captain Webb's chart indicates early post-operative stress indicators. His temperature is elevated. Patterson is 3 months out of school. He needs experienced monitoring. Are you refusing a direct order? Pierce's voice was quiet now, controlled, more dangerous than when it had cracked with indignation. I'm clarifying a patient safety concern. Hannah's voice matched his, level, precise, the voice of someone stating observable facts. Noted. Pierce turned to leave, then paused. You're reassigned. Effective now. I don't want you within 2 floors of Captain Webb's care. Do we understand each other? Perfectly, Hannah said. He left. Hannah continued distributing medications until her shift rotation officially ended, then moved through Cedar Creek Medical's corridors with the systematic purpose of someone conducting a final reconnaissance. She reached Webb's room at 1847 hours, moving past the nurse's station with her medication cart as cover. Webb was sleeping, his monitors showing elevated heart rate, temperature now 99.7 degrees, the slight inflammation that she recognized from field medicine, tissue trauma, early infection risk, the kind of complication that required experienced monitoring to catch before it became critical. She logged into the medication dispensing system using her access credentials, pulled up Webb's chart, and photographed 3 pages with the phone she kept in her scrub pocket. The images showed vital trends, surgical notes, her own observations. Then she logged out as the system locked her access to the geriatric wing only, effective immediately. Hannah walked out of Cedar Creek Medical at 1900 hours, past the parking lot where Denver twilight was softening the horizon, past the sodium lights beginning their evening hum, toward her Subaru with its faded unit patch hidden in a jacket pocket and a phone containing photographic evidence of everything she'd just witnessed. Captain Marcus Webb had arrived. Pierce had begun his systematic isolation. And Prophet, patient and precise, was running out of time. The intercom crackled at 0200 hours. Rapid response, cardiac unit, room 340. Hannah's hands froze mid-restock. Room 340. Webb's room. She moved before thinking. The geriatric wing dissolved behind her, abandoned hallways, humming fluorescent panels, the smell of antiseptic and something darker underneath. Her feet carried her toward the cardiac unit on pure instinct, muscle memory overriding protocol. She wasn't assigned there. Pierce had cut her access 3 days ago. But Webb couldn't die. Not yet. Not before his testimony could dismantle the network that funneled blood money across 2 continents. The cardiac unit was chaos. Monitors screaming. A crash cart rolling. New nurse Patterson stood frozen in room 340's doorway, her hands trembling like branches in wind, unable to move, unable to process what her eyes were seeing. Webb's monitor painted the story in electric green. His heart was seizing. Blood spread across the sheets like spilled wine, dark, persistent, wrong. Internal hemorrhage. The surgical site where they'd closed him 12 hours ago was coming apart. His sutures had torn. His pressure was dropping. 70 systolic. Then 65. Dr. Pierce arrived with the precision of a man who had performed this dance 1,000 times. His movements were clinical. Detached. Professional. Page surgery, he said to Patterson without looking at her. Get 2 units O negative up here. Prep for transfer to the OR. His voice carried the weight of institutional authority, a surgeon executing protocol, a man who knew exactly what to do and would do it exactly right. He didn't see the problem yet. He only saw the standard response. Hannah saw something different. The bleeding pattern. The trajectory. The specific geography of where Webb's blood was pooling beneath his ribs. She'd seen this exact presentation in a field hospital outside Kandahar, 3 kilometers from Phi-Base Salerno, where a Marine had taken shrapnel in the exact same spot. The sutures had held for 8 hours. Then they hadn't. The vessel hadn't just torn, it had severed. The artery was pumping his life into the space between his ribs, filling the thoracic cavity with blood instead of air. Standard protocol would kill him. He needs immediate intervention, Hannah said from the doorway. Her voice was flat. Clinical. A statement of fact, not a suggestion. Pierce didn't turn. He was adjusting the 4 rate, his fingers moving with the confidence of a man accustomed to being right. This doesn't concern you, Nurse Clarke. Return to your unit. The bleeding pattern indicates a severed vessel. He'll exsanguinate before surgery is ready. I didn't ask for your assessment. Pierce's voice had an edge now, the first note of irritation. A man unused to being questioned by someone he'd systematically eliminated from decision-making. He glanced at her for the first time, and his expression tightened. Security. Remove this nurse from my unit. Webb's systolic pressure hit 60. Hannah did the math in her head. 90 seconds. That was how long Webb had before his heart would have nothing left to pump. 3 minutes before his brain began to die. The security guard was 2 floors away, moving slow, following protocol. The OR was 5 minutes out. Patterson was still frozen. The resident, a doctor in name only, was pale and useless and breathing like a man approaching his own death. Dr. Pierce, he needs a thoracotomy. Now. Or he's gone. Pierce turned then. Fully turned. His face had shifted into something sharp and surgical. You are not qualified to make clinical decisions. You are not a physician. You will leave this unit, or I will have you removed. His voice carried the weight of institutional power, board certifications, malpractice insurance, a career built on the certainty that he was always the smartest person in the room. And when you leave, you're done. Finished. I'm calling the state licensing board with a formal complaint of practicing medicine without a license. I'll have your credentials suspended before the sun rises. Webb flatlined. The monitor went silent. No beep. No rhythm. Just a flat line and the terrible knowledge that brain death was no longer approaching, it was arriving. Hannah didn't hesitate. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory taking over from the parts of her mind that still cared about protocol. She grabbed the scalpel from the crash cart, the blade catching the fluorescent light like it was passing through water. The moment she moved, something in her face shifted, the civilian softness, the deferential nurse, the person who had spent 8 months accepting humiliation and isolation, all of it evaporated. What remained was something colder. Something surgical. Something that had performed emergency procedures in places where there were no oars, no anesthesia, no choice except act or watch someone die. "You're done. You're finished," Pierce was saying, but his voice had changed now. It was higher. Panicked. The voice of a man who'd just realized he was no longer the most dangerous person in the room. "Security. Get her out of here. Now." Hannah's hands were already moving through the field. Left intercostal space. 4th position. The scalpel went through skin and muscle like a door opening. There was blood, so much blood, but also the terrible clarity that came when the margin for error collapsed to nothing. The ribs were there. She found the landmarks, the spaces she could work in, the exact geometry of access to the thoracic cavity. Her fingers followed the path automatically, 12 years and 17 field procedures ahead of anything protocol could teach. The bleeding. She could see it now. The artery was severed, exactly as she'd calculated. Blood filled the left chest cavity like water in a basin. She clamped it with her bare hands, her fingers pinching the vessel shut, feeling the pulse underneath her palm trying to beat against the blockage. "Get me a stat transfusion." 2 units, pushed fast. "An O2, I need this oxy SATS climbing." Her voice was different now. Quieter but heavier. The voice of someone giving orders because people would obey, because standing in a room where someone was bleeding out transformed the entire hierarchy of expertise. Patterson, crash cart. Medication tray. Move. Patterson moved. The resident moved. Even Pierce moved, stepping back from the bed, his face the color of old paper, his institutional authority evaporating like rain on hot asphalt. He was trying to speak, trying to reassert control, but his words were dissolving into something that sounded like panic and disbelief. Hannah's hands worked. The clamp. The sterile saline. Her fingers knowing exactly what to do, where to go, how to hold a severed vessel together when there was no time, no resources, only the terrible imperative of keeping someone alive. She thought of Phoebe Salerno. She thought of the Marine who'd made it because her hands had remembered what they were supposed to do. She thought of Webb's testimony sitting unused in classified files because she wasn't allowed to tell anyone what she really was. O2 SATS climbing. 68, 72, 78. "He's got rhythm," the resident whispered. "I've got a pulse." But that wasn't the worst part for Pierce. The worst part was that security still hadn't arrived. The worst part was that Hannah's hands were steady and certain, and his weren't. The worst part was that she looked at him with absolute clarity in her eyes and said, "Call the OR. Tell them I'm bringing him up in 2 minutes." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Pierce's face went through several expressions simultaneously: rage, fear, desperation, and finally the terrible comprehension that she wasn't someone he could destroy. He pulled his phone out with shaking hands, and Hannah heard him speaking to hospital administration before security finally arrived at the doorway, confused about what they were supposed to do with a nurse who was in the middle of saving a life. "Leave her," Hannah said without looking up from her work. "Call the OR. Tell them it's a bleeding vessel, left anterior thoracotomy. I need their best cardiothoracic surgeon and a surgical tech. Tell them Captain Hannah Clarke says move now." She used her rank like a weapon. She wasn't authorized to use it. She wasn't supposed to reveal it. But Webb was stabilizing, and Pierce was backing away, and the moment was collapsing the distance between her cover and her truth. Security left. Pierce didn't follow, but he wasn't present anymore either. He stood in the corner, phone pressed to his ear, his voice shaking as he tried to explain to hospital administration why a nurse was performing emergency surgery and why she'd just invoked a military rank nobody at Cedar Creek Medical even knew she had. 2 minutes later, they were moving. The stretcher rolling. The monitors traveling with them. Hannah's hand still clamped around the severed vessel, feeling Webb's heartbeat, steady and persistent underneath her palms. The elevator doors opened. The hallway was empty except for the surgical team running toward them, their eyes wide, confused, responding to words they didn't understand from a nurse they didn't recognize, moving because something in Hannah's voice made them trust her completely. Behind them, in room 340, Dr. Pierce stood alone in the fluorescent light, his institutional authority crumbling like old paper, his careful strategy to eliminate Hannah Clarke demolished in the 2 minutes it had taken for her to refuse to let someone die. The charges would come soon. The accusations of practicing medicine without a license. The formal complaints. The systematic destruction he was already planning, his mind working frantically to find a way to make this her failure instead of his incompetence. But that wouldn't happen until tomorrow. For now, she had a captain to save. The monitor screamed flatline. Marcus Webb's chest rose once, twice, then nothing. His color drained from pink to the white of expensive paper, his pupils dilating as his brain starved for oxygen. For minutes. That's how long the brain lasts without blood. Hannah had for minutes to crack open a captain's chest with a scalpel meant for removing staples. She didn't ask permission. Permission was a luxury for nurses who weren't watching a man die from a bleeding artery that nobody else in this room knew how to find. Her hand moved on its own. Muscle memory took over, the kind that only comes from doing this in a field hospital 20 kilometers from Kandahar while mortar fire shook the tent. The scalpel from the crash cart felt familiar in her grip, almost like coming home. She pressed the blade below his left breast and cut downward in one smooth motion, her movement so precise that a resident watching later would swear it was beautiful, like watching a surgeon in her 10th year, not a nurse supposedly trained only in vitals and bedside manner. Blood welled up. Rich, dark, arterial blood that meant seconds were burning away. "Retractors," she said. Her voice wasn't a request. It was the kind of command that makes grown men move without questioning why a floor nurse was holding the blade. A young resident, couldn't have been more than a year post-med school, stepped forward with trembling hands and froze when he saw the open chest cavity. His face went gray. Then green. Then he stumbled backward toward the corner, his hand over his mouth, and the sound of him vomiting into a biohazard container filled the monitor's flatline wail like a horrible percussion section. Patterson, the charge nurse, stared with her mouth open. She'd never seen this version of Hannah Clarke. The version with hands that moved like a concert pianist playing a piece written in blood and pressure and the terrifying mathematics of hemorrhage control. Hannah's right hand went into Webb's chest cavity. Bare fingers. No gloves. No time for gloves. She could feel the torn artery, the edges slick and unraveling, and her fingers closed around it with the certainty of someone who'd held human arteries together in worse conditions than this sterile hospital room. Much worse. She could do this in her sleep. "Clamp," she said. Patterson's hands moved with sudden understanding. She produced the vascular clamp like Hannah had spoken some ancient medical dialect that short-circuited the normal hesitation between orders and action. Hannah guided it into position with her free hand, her other hand still applying pressure on the bleed. The clamp locked down with a soft metallic click. Sinus rhythm appeared on the monitor. A single spike. Then another. Hannah stepped back slightly, her left hand moving to assist Patterson with the retractor angle. "Suture," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. It didn't sound like the quiet blonde nurse anymore. It sounded like someone who'd sewn humans back together in conditions that would make this trauma bay look like a vacation resort. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway, his face carved from confusion and something darker, the realization that the hierarchy he'd constructed all morning had just evaporated. His authority, his position, his certainty that he was the smartest person in every room, all of it suddenly hollow as he watched a floor nurse close a thoracotomy like she was performing her 100th, not her first in civilian clothes. Hannah tied off the final suture with movements that could have been filmed for a surgical textbook. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser. The monitor now showed a rhythm that wasn't quite normal but was emphatically, undeniably alive. Webb's color was starting to pink again as blood flowed back to his brain. Oxygen saturation climbing, 72. 78, 84. 91. Get him to the OR, Hannah said, stepping back. Surgeons need to reinforce the repair, but he's stable for transport. The room moved with sudden unified purpose. The surgical team arrived like they'd been waiting just outside for someone competent to take command. They wheeled Webb out of the trauma bay with steady movements, and only then did the silence arrive, the kind of silence that comes after something impossible has just become undeniably real. Pierce's expression shifted from shock to calculation in the span of one breath. Hannah had seen this before. The moment when a cornered predator decides which way to strike. She was washing her hands under the sink when he made his first phone call, his voice carrying across the trauma bay with surgical precision. Cedar Creek Security. I need an escort to the staff lockers. Immediate. His tone was measured, controlled, the voice of a man constructing a narrative that would serve him far better than the truth. We have a terminated employee who needs to be removed from the premises. Hannah didn't look up. The soap smelled like antiseptic and failure. She could feel every eye in the room avoiding hers now, the weight of their confusion and fear pressing down like humidity before a storm. Pierce's second call came while she was still drying her hands. State Board of Nursing. I need to report an incident of unauthorized surgical procedure, complete scope violation, immediate danger to patient safety. His voice was almost gentle now, the tone of a disappointed mentor. The nurse's name is Hannah Clarke. Yes, I'll wait. The third call, the one to the hospital's legal team, took place as she walked toward the staff lockers. She could hear him behind her, his voice steady as a metronome. Unauthorized procedure. No physician supervision. Potential criminal negligence. I'm recommending immediate termination and full legal protection for the hospital. Yes, full documentation is being prepared. Security arrived before she'd packed half her belongings. 2 guards, both looking uncomfortable, both clearly briefed that this was a situation requiring neutrality and procedure above all else. They didn't look at her face. They looked at the cardboard box she was filling with her personal effects like it was the only thing in the room that mattered. Hannah placed her badge on top of the contents. The hospital ID that had let her move through Cedar Creek Medical with purpose for 8 months. 8 months of carefully documented fraudulent billing patterns. 8 months of photographed kickback arrangements. 8 months of intelligence that proved Dr. Pierce had been funneling hospital billing codes toward phantom procedures, rerouting the money through a network of shell companies that led directly to funding sources in Peshawar with very specific connections to very specific armed groups with very specific interest in disrupting supply chains to forward operating bases. She couldn't explain any of this. She couldn't say that Captain Marcus Webb, the man whose chest she'd just cracked open, had been shot during an ambush that Hannah herself had led him through 6 years ago. That she'd held him while his blood soaked through her combat uniform in a poppy field outside Bagram. That his call sign had been the last thing she thought about before falling asleep most nights since, because the ambush had been orchestrated by a Pakistani contractor with direct ties to the funding Pierce was funneling. She couldn't say that this job wasn't a career. It was a mission. It was 8 months of civilian softness stretched over military bones, 8 months of biting her tongue and accepting humiliation and watching Pierce dismantle her allies one by one, because exposing him too early would compromise the investigation into where the money actually went. She couldn't say anything at all. Your employment is terminated effective immediately, one of the guards said, not unkindly. He was just reading from a script, following protocol. You'll receive your final paycheck within 10 business days. Security will escort you from the premises. Dr. Pierce stood by her locker as they walked her toward the exit, his arms folded across his chest, his expression arranged into something that looked like justified satisfaction. Your nursing career is over, Miss Clarke, he said quietly. I'll personally ensure every hospital in Colorado knows your name. Hannah shifted the cardboard box on her hip. The movement brought her eyes level with his, and for one moment, just one, his certainty flickered. Something in her face reminded him that she was still the woman who'd walked into that trauma bay and operated like she had blood in the place where most people kept fear. Then she looked away. The hospital doors slid open, and the Denver night air hit her like cold water. It was raining, the kind of rain that comes in October, hard and purposeful and cold enough to make the world feel small. Hannah walked through it as if it didn't dare touch her, crossed the parking lot with her cardboard box growing heavier with each step, and found herself at a bus stop 3 blocks from Cedar Creek Medical because calling her handler would mean admitting that the mission was compromised, that she'd blown her cover to save a man, that 8 months of intelligence work had just gone sideways in a 30-second trauma bay intervention. The rain fell on her scrubs. The cardboard box grew soft at the edges. Inside it, the cracked ceramic mug from her apartment. The succulent she'd bought to make herself look civilian, now wilting. Her personal effects. Her carefully constructed life as Hannah Clarke, nurse. And tucked between the dying plant and the box's edge, the water-stained photograph. Her unit. Her team. The 6 soldiers who'd been in the convoy before the ambush. 4 of them came home. She stared at the photo in the rain and tried to remember why she'd thought she could save Marcus Webb without destroying everything else. That was the last thought she had before the world split open in ways she couldn't control anymore. The next morning arrived like an execution stayed at dawn. Hannah sat in the Cedar Creek lobby at 08 for 7 hours, reviewing discharge paperwork she no longer had clearance to file, when the automatic doors slid open and Marcus Webb appeared in a wheelchair, his post-op bandaging still fresh, his Marine escort walking beside him with a folder under one arm. The morning light caught Webb's face as the orderly pushed him forward, and his eyes, combat sharp, trained to read a room in half a second, locked directly on hers. Not a glance. A lock. Recognition hitting him like a frag grenade. His lips formed a single word, barely a whisper across the space between the information desk and the lobby seating. Profit. The volume was nothing. The impact was everything. The word cut through the ambient noise of the hospital, the ventilator hiss from the trauma bays, the overhead paging system droning a code somewhere in the East Wing, the shuffle of visitors and staff moving like ghosts through the morning routine. That one word shattered the careful architecture Hannah had built over 8 months. She didn't move. She didn't acknowledge. She simply let him see her face and watched understanding cascade through his expression like a controlled demolition. The Marine escort noticed the shift in Webb's attention, followed his gaze, and suddenly something shifted in the escort's posture too. That small movement, a straightening of the spine, a recognition, was the first domino. The second domino came in the form of a citation. The Marine placed the folder on Webb's lap and, standing at parade rest in the middle of the Cedar Creek lobby with its fluorescent lights humming their endless aluminum song, began to read aloud. His voice carried the formal cadence of military commendation. For exceptional valor under fire. For carrying 3 wounded personnel through an active kill box at Bagram Airfield, Loga Province, while coordinating air support under sniper fire. For maintaining command presence when surrounded by enemy contact and extracting her team with 0 casualties despite heavy engagement. A pause. The Marine's eyes moved to Hannah's face. Captain Hannah Marie Clarke, 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. People stopped moving. A nurse at the information desk set down her phone. A doctor walking past slowed, confused by the formality materializing in the lobby like a ghost in dress blues. The Marine continued, each word a stone placed deliberately on top of the last. Acting as battalion medical officer, she sustained 2 shrapnel wounds, refused evacuation, and continued treating casualties for 17 hours until medevac support arrived. For her actions on that date, she received the Silver Star and 2 Purple Hearts for combat wounds sustained in the line of duty. That wasn't the Marine escort speaking anymore. That was the beginning of the end. That was the machinery of an entirely different institution, moving with the precision of something that had spent 8 months watching and waiting. A man in a dress uniform materialized from the direction of the hospital director's office. 2 stars on his shoulders. The kind of rank that changed the temperature of rooms simply by entering them. He walked directly to Hannah, his movement economical and purposeful, the way combat officers moved through spaces they decided to occupy. His salute was crisp, palm flat, a gesture of acknowledgement that meant something different in this context than it would have in any other space. Not subordination. Recognition. Hannah rose to meet the salute, and in that moment the faded nurse with the careful documentation and the meticulous chart notes ceased to exist. What stood was something else entirely. Something that had been there all along, buried under civilian softness and scrub-issued passivity, waiting for the moment when invisibility was no longer an operational requirement. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Pierce. The worst was what arrived exactly 17 minutes later, in the form of 3 men in dark suits carrying federal credentials like weapons. They found him in his office at Cedar Creek. The Pentagon investigators moved with the choreography of people who'd done this thousands of times. One stood in the doorway as a blocking mechanism. One sat in the chair across from Pierce's desk. One opened a laptop on the corner of the desk and tilted the screen where Pierce could see it. Federal credentials appeared first. Then came the documentation. 8 months of it. Hannah's meticulous charting style that Pierce had tried to exploit as evidence of scope creep and unauthorized decision-making became something else entirely when examined alongside billing records from the hospital's financial department. Every inflated code. Every phantom procedure. Every kickback traced to shell companies with routing numbers that fed back through international accounts into destinations that triggered automatic alerts in federal databases. The lead investigator spoke with a kind of calm that indicated he'd already won. Your attempts to forge Captain Clarke's personnel records 2 hours after her emergency intervention on Captain Marcus Webb have triggered digital signatures across 3 federal systems. The email server logs show you accessed her credentials at 2,143 hours. You modified her file status at 2,156 hours. You forwarded documentation of these modifications to hospital legal at 2,209 hours, stating that we should move quickly on her termination before she files a complaint with the state board. A pause. The investigator let that sit. You tried to build a case against a federal asset in the middle of a medical fraud investigation. Your personal panic move exposed your entire network. The FBI agents appeared within the hour. They seized Pierce's phone, his laptop, his office files. They walked hospital administrators through the infrastructure of his fraud network, $40 million across Cedar Creek Medical and 6 other hospitals. They showed him documentation of how his system of reassigning nurses, restricting access, and isolating Hannah from key patients wasn't bullying. It was obstruction of a federal investigation. Every humiliation became conspiracy. Every public written warning became evidence. Every phone call designed to build a termination case became documentation of consciousness of guilt. By the time the FBI finished, Dr. Pierce's attorney was the only thing standing between him and immediate arrest. His medical license was suspended pending investigation. His partners were already negotiating plea agreements with the federal prosecutor. The defense contractors who'd been funneling money through his billing codes to finance 3 insurgent cells in Helmand Province had no idea their entire network had been documented by a nurse they'd tried to fire for exceeding her scope. Hannah watched parts of this from a Pentagon briefing room, now wearing her dress uniform with its own decorations, the one she'd never worn in this building, the ones that meant something entirely different than the scrubs and badge she'd carried for 8 months. Her commanding officer walked through the digital forensics with her, the traced money, the identified insurgent cells, the defense contractors already facing conspiracy charges. Webb's testimony, protected by her presence at Cedar Creek, was going to put 2 men in federal prison for life. Maria, the older nurse who'd almost spoken during Hannah's humiliation, had finally provided her statement about Pierce's intimidation tactics. Patterson, the young nurse who'd frozen during Webb's code, had documented every order Pierce had issued to delay Hannah's access to critical patients. The hospital settled with Hannah quietly, but she didn't want money. She wanted her nursing license cleared. She wanted the victims of Pierce's billing fraud compensated. She wanted the documentary record to show that sometimes the quiet person in the room, the one who seemed to be taking the abuse, had been documenting the entire time. Patience isn't weakness. Patience is a weapon in the hands of someone trained to use it. 6 months passed. The trial moved through the federal court system with the inexorable weight of documented crime. Pierce's conviction took 3 days of jury deliberation. His sentencing was 18 months in federal prison. But the public destruction was already written in the space between his conviction and the day Hannah actually saw him again. She was stopped at a red light on South Gaylord Street, her civilian car idling in afternoon traffic, when she glanced left and saw a medical supply van pulling toward the loading zone of a retail center. The van doors were open. A man in civilian clothes, wearing an electronic monitoring anklet visible above his shoe, was loading cardboard boxes under the supervision of a community service coordinator with a clipboard. The man's hands moved without their old confidence. His face carried the hollowed-out quality of someone who'd spent half a year understanding that every single institution that had protected his fraud, every administrator who'd looked away, every colleague who'd profited from the scheme, all of them had scattered the moment the federal government arrived. Pierce looked up. His eyes found her face through the window of her car. There was a moment, maybe 2 seconds, where recognition happened again. But this time it was different. This time he was seeing what she'd been the entire time. Not a nurse. Not even a captain. A person who'd sat in her cardboard box at a bus stop in the rain and waited for the machinery of an entire federal system to confirm what she'd already documented so carefully that there was no room for doubt. The light turned green. Hannah drove away. She didn't look in the mirror. She didn't need to. She already knew what she'd left behind. 6 months after that, Cedar Creek Medical's main auditorium filled with hospital staff, military personnel, and 3 rangers from Hannah's unit at Bagram. The faded unit patch, the one sewn into her jacket lining for 8 months, sat retired in a shadow box on the stage, mounted beside her commendations. Hannah stood at the podium in her dress uniform, listening to the hospital director read a formal apology into the record, announcing new protocols for protecting whistleblowers and embedded personnel. Maria received recognition for her eventual testimony. Patterson was promoted, her credentials no longer questioned. When the hospital director handed her the podium, Hannah's voice came out controlled and measured, the voice of someone who'd learned to carry authority without announcing it. The mission required becoming invisible. It required enduring humiliation without response. It required trusting that competence and documentation would speak when I could not. She paused, her eyes moving across the audience. Some battles are fought with scalpels and chart notes instead of rifles. Some enemies wear white coats instead of uniforms. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Captain Marcus Webb sat in the front row in his own dress uniform, the prophet tattoo visible on his forearm, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he was the first to stand. The 3 other rangers followed. Their salutes came in unison, a recognition that was also a redemption. Hannah had carried Webb through fire at Bagram. She'd saved him again at Cedar Creek, this time without a weapon in her hand, armed only with a scalpel and 8 months of meticulous documentation. The debt balanced. The mission completed. Subscribe for more stories of warriors in unexpected places. Like this video if you believe sometimes the quiet person in the room is the most dangerous. Comment below, what would you have done if you'd been standing next to someone who knew your secret the entire time?